Yo, what's up? Welcome back. I'm back home, and that means more Mythic Plus content. As we have this week's reset, we have some stuff to talk about, varying from comps to dungeon tuning to what the affixes were looking like last week and how that might potentially change the affixes and how those are looking this week. And then I fished up a Chinese VOD to kind of talk about some of the stuff that we're seeing with some of the different specs. So first and foremost, let's hammer Mythic Plus tuning coming with the weekly reset. I don't think it's any surprise that we're seeing some Mythic Plus tuning happening. I think that there are some dungeons like Grim Batol, as you see on screen here, that were vastly more challenging than other dungeons, such as Arakara and Mists of Tyrannus Scythe. In addition to that, I think that there's this problem where some dungeons are just fine-ish to play in a coordinated group, but absolutely nuclear in a pug. And I think that, Necrotic Wake is probably a good example of that, from my opinion, where Mist of Tyrannus Scythe is incredibly easy to pug in comparison. I think that, Arakara also not that hard to pug, but you can at least wipe to the last boss, where Mist of Tyrannus Scythe is basically just hold W, don't die, you time the key. And so let's take a second to kind of look at what's actually changing with some of the dungeons. As you can see, Grim Batol has some changes, for Dagger Shadowburner, improved the visibility of Twilight Wind, movement speed of the Twilight Wind reduced by 15%, movement speed reduction to players inside the area triggered reduced to 10%, and also fix an issue that allow players to be hit by multiple times by the Twilight Wind. So these are all mostly phase 1 changes. I think that, in general, this fight was pretty obnoxious for ranged DPS to actually get casts on this boss. The Twilight Wind was most of that, right? Where the winds were just moving too fast around the room and you were canceling your cast too much. I think that in general for, an average player, they were going to be losing way too much uptime compared to what they should be losing. You also had these spawning pretty much all the time. And so I think that reducing the number of these and increasing the visibility of these is pretty good. They also, for the third boss as well, this isn't tagged as the third boss, but this is the dragon. So the dragon's HP has been reduced by 30%. The dragon still killed at 50%, but a 13% health nerf is massive. I think that is spot on for what they should be looking to do with this boss. I think this boss was just too long. You ended up getting so many more ads because the fight has so much health. So now you're going to be getting fewer ads. The fight's going to have fewer HP. You should be able to actually make up a lot of time with this mob actually reducing its health. Mutated Hatchling. These mobs can absolutely sauce your tank. With that being the case, now their melee damage has been reduced by 66%. I think that this is fair. I don't think that my tank should be getting auto-attacked to death by these mobs. Just in terms of what these mobs were, I think that the fact, their shadow damage taken thing should be their effect, not them swinging my tank to death. And there's a lot of mobs, I think, that going from the 11 to 12 range is absolutely bonkers right now. And every tank is basically getting white swung to death. And so, these mobs are fine to actually get changed. Eridax, which is the final boss. Abyssal Corruption now targets 2 players, was previously 3. The Abyssal Corruption are those circles that players get. I think that this is a great change. So basically you're in a pretty cramped circle just in general. And so it was actually pretty difficult to get all 3 of those players not stacked on top of one another. In addition to that, if it ended up ever if you ended up having your players stacked for whatever reason at the very beginning, with it targeting 3 different players as opposed to 2, there was a likely chance of it, being 2 players with the debuff stacked on top of one another and it immediately killing both of them. It's less likely to be the case, but it's still, I think this change is still fine. I would actually love to see maybe a little bit of a grace period, a 2 or 3 second grace period whenever you get the Abyssal Corruption circle. If they would add that would be phenomenal in my opinion, because then that would allow players to actually be able to move and get away from the rest of the group and have sufficient counterplay, because right now it just does damage way too fast. Last thing for Grim Batol is Lava Benders. Scorching Heat's damage reduced by 25%. Thank God. The double Lava Bender pack basically was one that you couldn't ever accidentally or purposefully push at the same time, otherwise you're going to be wiping. These mobs were also pretty much incapable of being pulled with other trash mobs or warlocks or literally anything else. By reducing the Scorching Heat damage, that's basically what needs to happen. there is still a bug with the ground effect with whenever the mob is transformed. I think it has to do with like the transformation animation, like making the ground effect not show up. So just make sure you're watching out for that cast of that ability whenever the mob is like transforming. Otherwise, you might get hit by it because it can be invisible. For Boralus, Scrimshaw Gutter now no longer flees at low health. Chopper Red Hook players now gain a short immunity to Irontide Cleaver's heavy slash after suffering from Iron Hook. Thank God. Irontide Raider and Ashvane Commander. This is like a pack that's at the very end of the dungeon. They've adjusted the timings of Iron Hook and Azurite Charge. Basically, they don't want you to get like one shot. I think the Black Tar Bomber, like Irontide Raider combo, is pretty obnoxious. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not in love with the Irontide Raider just as a general mob. I think that this mob is pretty effing annoying. I would be also looking to change something at the very end of the dungeon. So for the last boss, there is a... First off, Putrid Waters is just a really bad mechanic. So Putrid Waters is the Dispel mechanic on Vic Goth, where you get debuffed, and it does way too much upfront damage. I think the damage should... I mean, the damage that the dot does is already like pretty severe, but I think the upfront damage from the Putrid Waters is just way too high to the point where you're getting like one shot even in like an 11 or a 12 from it, which is bananas. But then there's also this like overlap, and it only happens, well, it can happen later, but it typically only happens at the very beginning of the fight, where the second slam of the entire fight is completely overlapped with the Putrid Waters application. So you have to basically press like a 50% DR and all group defensives and whatnot to not just like explode to that mechanic. And I would desync the cast time of that. I would make Putrid Waters initial hit 15% of the amount that it currently does, and then just have it be that dot mechanic and that dispel mechanic as opposed to like the initial hit. Because in addition to that, the Putrid Waters is like nearly impossible to actually DR, because you have to DR it prior to the boss actually casting the ability because of how the travel time on it works, and it just feels really unfair. I would be looking to change that. I would be looking to change the Black Tar Bomber Irontide Raider mechanic. I would actually maybe make the Irontide Raider Iron Hook do like way less damage as well, because it doesn't feel like a satisfying thing that it does just so much damage, because it's like an unavoidable mechanic. And it's not necessarily a problem that it's like an unavoidable mechanic. I think that like the hook mechanic is kind of interesting, and I think the fact that it has to move you. I don't think that the damage should be in the Iron Hook though. I think the damage should be attached to like the avoidable part of this, which is like the AoE that the Irontide Raider does after the fact. I don't think anybody's ever like upset about that. Last change is like Stonevault, Rock Smasher. These are the mobs that are at the very end of the dungeon now cast Smash Rock less frequently. I'm interested in seeing how less frequent that's going to be. Is it no longer going to permanently stack the debuff on you? Could be interesting. Also, the Turn Speaker now casts Censoring Gear less frequently. This is the ability that can silence you. So those are all the changes that we had for the dungeons. We also had Oblivion on this most recent reset. And Oblivion started off a bit obnoxious, where bosses like Vic Goth, Tradova were really annoying. And I think they hotfixed something in the middle of the week where Oblivion would stop like hitting Vic Goth, because originally there was like this weird issue with Oblivion where it would prioritize the nearest mob to target, and this is how it was all of beta. But once it came out, there's like a couple of instances where it's pretty obnoxious, and Squishy talked about it being very similar to like Quaking, where most of the time it's not even that big of a deal, but the times that it's annoying are like really annoying. Yeah, so we had Oblivion. It was okay most of the time, and sometimes it was not great. But good news, I think that if we get Voidbound's a lot easier. Basically, just hard focus the emissary as it spawns. That's not too challenging. It also gives the mobs like a DR. I also think the 20% cooldown rate and 10% critical strike is like a great buff. Devour is much harder than Voidbound, probably less harder than Oblivion, but not easy by any means. I would recommend inviting a shaman to your group and having them have Poison Cleansing Totem for pretty much the entire week, because that makes Devour quite easy. But yeah, this is basically a dispel mechanic. You can, in theory, heal it off, but it's not the easiest thing to heal off. Okay, so those were kind of the things that we saw for the week. let's kind of take a look at what we've been seeing with comps and whatnot, because I think that players are now starting to push keys a little bit more, and I think that we're having a better representation of what's going on. So right now, it seems like Aug Evoker and Frost Death Knight have been probably the two most popular specs at high end. Basically, the reason that Aug Evoker is so popular is because tank survivability. After you go over that plus 12 affix and you get the Guile, and it has 20% increased damage, 20% increased health on all the mobs, the 20% increased damage that the mobs are doing, effectively they're just white swinging your tank to death. Basically, they'll just auto attack your tank to death, and the spec that's the best at solving that is Aug Evoker, of course. Frankly, I think that the amount of damage that players are doing, if say it was only the 20% health and it wasn't the 20% damage, you probably wouldn't be looking to play an Aug Evoker. You wouldn't necessarily need it because the damage that you're doing is fine, right? The amount of health that the mob has relative to the damage you're doing is pretty much spot on. The issue is the amount of damage that your group, and particularly your tank, are taking is way high, and I think that Aug Evoker is so back in the meta right now because of that. For DK is just, the most sturdy DPS, and it does probably the highest damage, both priority and AoE damage. Now, I think that there are some instances where some other specs, such as Enhancement Shaman or Assassination Rogue, can beat them in like overall damage. But in general, I think that DK is also unkillable. The utility that the DK provides with things like grips is actually quite valuable this season. And so I think that DK is like a mainstay of like the high-end compositions that as you can already see here. As for third DPS options, you see a lot of different stuff. Enhancement Shaman's popular, Mage is popular, Balanced Druid can be pretty good, Rogue is fairly solid. We even see some stuff like a Fury Warrior from time to time. You could even potentially see a second Death Knight. I don't see a reason that would even be particularly bad, but it seems like the DPS comp is a lot of DK, a lot of Aug Evoker. Now for healers, as you can see right here, there is a lot of Resto Shaman. And if you look at 10 and up, and you swap by healer, about half the keys at 10 and up are played by Resto Shaman, 55% to be exact. Now, that's not the worst that we've ever seen. Typically, the most stale of metas will be like 70%. The reason that people are playing with Resto Shaman is that it's just really easy to play with, frankly. Vigor and Downpour giving you HP gain is incredibly potent. On beta, the only two healers that were actually able to hit the HPS checks that were steep were Resto Shaman and Preservation Evoker. And Preservation Evoker is quite good, but it's underplayed. And honestly, Shaman is just easier to play with. 12-second interrupt is very valuable. The utility is quite good. It's mostly due to the fact, though, that you're getting a little. I think that Shaman is just a little bit easier to play with, so people are playing with it. Now you do see some Presevokers. I think that Presevoker has the amount of HPS that is required to actually be able to deal with what's going on this season. Then you see like a Mystery Among Ordemus is playing as well, but like in general, it's going to be pretty dominated by Restoration Shamans, in my opinion. As for tanks, we're seeing. It's a lot of DK, or it's not DKs. It's a lot of Prot Warriors and it's a lot of Guardian Druids. You see some Demon Hunter a little bit. You even see like oh my god, there's just playing Prot Paladin randomly. But I think that the tanks are mostly balanced. I think the worst tank by far is like Pally. But yeah, a lot of the tanks are pretty good. Even at like 10 and up, you see DK actually be very popular. As you get over that plus 12 affix, though, the warrior becomes really good because, like I talked about earlier, getting white swung on, what is warrior good at? Blocking physical damage. And then, obviously, bear druid, kind of similar vein. Bear druids are pretty much just pulling around their incarn, doing big pulls around their incarn, and that's, that's the way you want to play Mythic Plus, right? You want to stack your offensive with your defensive CDs and pull as big as possible whenever everybody's got offensive cooldowns. So what you might have also noticed is at the top, you have some Chinese teams that are playing like Unholy DK and Frost Mage sometimes, and you're just like, what is going on with that? Where most other people are playing Frost DK and Arcane Mage. And so I did some VOD fishing, and I was trying to figure out, like, for what reason would they even be playing Unholy DK? Frost Mage, I think he just likes Frost. I suspect that's going to be the answer. The Unholy DK was the weird one because I was like, I wonder if this actually has merit to being better than Frost DK in some situations. And the answer that I've come to is yes. I think in very specific circumstances, so like the first pull of Arakara and the first pull of Stonevault have some spots where your Unholy Death Knight bursts for 16 million DPS and absolutely just dunks on the trash pack, and then that carries them for quite literally the rest of the dungeon. Because I mean, look at the damage right here. So this guy's at 15 million DPS right here. This is in tens of thousands, and so they're basically just all inning the first pull of the dungeon and doing the first pull of Arakara full left side. The first pull of Stonevault is like triple pull, and they're just all inning their timer at the very beginning to the point where, you know, while the Unholy DK is probably slightly worse for the remainder of the key, it's not bad, but it's going to be slightly worse for the remainder of the key. But they front loaded all the difficulty to the point where the Unholy DK just pops the F off, does 1 gorillion DPS at the very beginning, and then that carries them throughout the remainder of the key. Then on top of that, you know, they're playing with this Guardian Druid, like I talked about, pulling around Incarn and whatnot, and so then it ends up making sense as to how that Unholy DK ends up entering into the mix. I suspect that Arcane is probably just better than Frost, but I think that this is the one that I'm the least confident in long term. We'll see. I think that Frost was good on the beta, but most people tended to play towards Arcane because Arcane was the best single target profile for Mythic Plus. It had insane priority damage and ability to blow up specific mobs in a pack, which is always going to be valuable, especially whenever you're basically kind of, this season's weird because you're just like holding W, don't die, keep everybody alive, and then you have enough damage to time the key. But, you know, an Arcane Mage excels at that like heavily. Anyways, that's basically everything we've seen this week and kind of what to expect. I will be back next week with a similar style video talking about what we've been seeing from compositions and new changes. Maybe we'll have some new dungeon tuning. Who really knows? But I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.